How does one hate a country? I know people. I know towns and farms and hills and rivers and rocks. I know how the sun at sunset in autumn falls on the side of a certain plowland in the hills. But what is the sense of giving a boundary to all that? Giving it a name and ceasing to love where the name ceases to apply? What is love of one's country? Is it hate of one's uncountry? Insofar as I love life, I love the hills of the domain of Estra, but that sort of love does not come with a boundary line of hate. That was Ursula K Le Guin in her groundbreaking novel, The Left Hand of Darkness. And this is The Red Pen. Hello everyone, and welcome to The Red Pen, where we cut up fiction to see what it's made of. I'm Austin Chant.
And I'm Amanda Jean.
This is episode 1, so before we get into the radical gender theory, we're going to talk about our vision for the show and what we're going to be doing here.
And also who we are.
We are. Yes. In case you have not listened to our previous podcast, The Hopeless Romantic, we're a couple of goons from the internet. I mean, it's true.
It is true. I can't argue with that.
We are two friends who happen to be writers and editors. I am an author of sci-fi, fantasy, and romance. And Amanda, who the hell are you?
I'm an editor of all of those things and much more.
So we came up with the idea for the Red Pen because both of us are, how do you say it, nerds?
Big ol' nerds.
Big old nerds of the academic and fandom-y variety where we like to sink our teeth into stuff. We wanted to have a podcast where we could do some deep dives into fiction, what makes it work on both a micro scale and a macro scale. We're going to be taking a look at all kinds of fiction, starting with literature, because of course we're big book nerds, but also looking at everything from video games to TV to film, plays to comics to, I don't know, earlier I was like, I probably have some deep thoughts on like transmedia marketing campaigns in there somewhere. We're really not restricting it to any particular genre or type of media, but what we want to do is do a really thorough look at what makes these stories work, what makes them great. Each episode, one of us will pick a topic or a piece of media that's important to us that we think we have stuff to learn from, and do a deep dive into what makes it tick or some really important aspect of it. And we're going to be trading off sort of the role of the expert every week. So this week we're going to be starting with me being a gender expert, as I am known in professional circles.
Austin Chant, PhD.
That's me. But in all seriousness, I am drawing on so much of my academic background for this. I felt like when I was putting together my outline for this episode, I was writing a research paper or something, which is really fun. And that's exactly why we chose this format for the podcast, is because we're the kind of people who sort of naturally are inclined to do that when we are excited about something. We want to tear it to shreds and digest it and then turn it to our own purposes, which is grisly. And that's also why we chose the ominous name and marketing for this podcast.
Our tagline is we cut up fiction to see what it's made of. And we honestly did debate whether we wanted to say dissect.
Yeah.
And I thought that might be just like a little heavy-handed, the hand that wields the scalpel. I'm pretty okay with the level of ominousness and portent.
Threat?
Yeah, just the casual level of threat that this podcast, its blood red color and a little unnerving tagline seems to convey. Very on brand for us.
That's us, in a nutshell.
All right, well, without further ado, Austin, will you take me to Gender Church or Gurch?
I would love to take you to Gurch, Amanda. So the first episode I wanted to do for this show is about sci-fi as a means of exploring gender, specifically human gender. I realized I had just sort of naturally limited myself to sci-fi and fantasy that is about alternate conceptions of human gender, specifically like not aliens, not monsters, not elves, not dragons. These are all stories about some particularly sort of far-fetched or divergent ideas of humans and gender, but they're all very much about human gender.
They're all recognizably human.
It came together for me because I was reading J.Y. Yang's excellent Tensorate series, which begins with The Black Tides of Heaven and continues into The Red Threads of Fortune and The Descent of Monsters. All excellent books, and I wound up... I think they're really interesting takes on an alternate gender system in a way that is fairly unique to what I have seen especially from mainstream sci-fi fantasy. They're very, very cool. And so I wanted to talk about them, but I also wanted to look at some older sci-fi, and then I specifically read The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin.
You forgot the K.
Ursula K Le Guin.
The K is important.
It's important because the other book that I had read, which I am going to talk about from the same period, was Venus Plus X by Theodore Sturgeon, which is a really interesting book and doesn't, as far as I know, have as much of a sort of legacy as The Left Hand of Darkness, though I don't want to besmirch the name of an elder in the genre. I don't think it's a great book. I don't know. Personally, for me, I don't think it's... I think
Pistols
it's
at Dawn, my friend.
I'm sorry.
I don't care.
It's a book that suffers from being more of sort of a ideological treatise than it is a novel. I read The Left Hand of Darkness for the first time thinking, this will be an interesting thought exercise / counterpoint to The Left Hand of Darkness. If that makes it sound like I had low expectations, that's because I did, and I will talk a little bit about why, because I also don't want to besmirch the good name of Ursula K Le Guin. I read it expecting not necessarily to cry so much on the bus while reading it and clutch it to my heart and die.
And then try and find an attractive version to buy in hard copy.
Yeah, and then spend 20 years trying to find an attractive print copy of that book that isn't just a picture of an iceberg, a real iceberg from Earth on the cover. Come on, people.
I don't understand. It's such a popular book. This is a novel of recent sci-fi fantasy canon. Like, it's big. And yet somehow they're like, look, you get this shitty paperback that looks like it could be any penguin.
Yeah, I think it's because they're trying to market it to non-sci-fi audiences, and I have a lot of feelings about that. But that's not this episode. This episode's about gender. I wound up having a lot more to say about The Left Hand of Darkness, and I'm actually going to start there. And I'm going to start with why it took me so long to pick this book up, even though it was a book that I knew from a very young age that I should read, quote unquote, and that was very influential and queer and all that jazz. And the reason that I had reservations about Left Hand of Darkness is because of TERFs.
Yeah.
If you're not immediately familiar with the term TERF, it is trans exclusionary radical feminist, and I had a lot of concerns that The Left Hand of Darkness, from what I had heard, was going to be predicated on some tenets of TERF ideology that are loathsome, because my understanding going in was that this was a book that held that gender is a system of marginalization based on gender assigned at birth, and that it always has winners and losers, and that is something that is inherent to TERF ideology and is then sort of translated into the attempt of trans people to make anything else out of gender is undermining and directly opposed to the struggle of women and against feminism. And that by trying to uphold gender as a source of like personal truth or joy or rightness or anything that a person is just inherently meant to be, trans people are acting in opposition to women's rights. It's bad. That's a bad ideology, but I understand it really well because it's informed my relationship with my mother for a long time. And so this was a story that I was very concerned about reading and was not expecting to connect with, I guess. I was expecting it to be well written and interesting, but I was expecting sort of an ideological ping and for it to be an uncomfortable read.
Yeah, you weren't expecting it to be a pleasant experience for you.
No, exactly. I was expecting it to be something I read in an academic way to be able to dissect, but not for pleasure. Ultimately, I think, and I'll go deeper into this as we go along, I don't think Left Hand of Darkness actually does map onto that ideology very well. And I also don't think that Venus Plus X does. They're in many ways very similar stories. The Left Hand of Darkness explicates itself better and is a better book. I'm just gonna throw down on that. It's a better book.
You see no argument from my quarter. I agree.
No. And I'll talk about why. I think The Left Hand of Darkness has some really interesting things to say. I don't see it as in opposition to more recent novels. Like my recent examples are going to be the Tensorate series and All Systems Red and the Murderbot series by Marcia Wells. Martha? Yep. The Murderbot series by Martha Wells.
I wasn't making strange noises at you in the background because you said Marcia Wells. It was because I have a lot of feelings about Murderbot. And the fact that you're going to even briefly touch on Murderbot. I'm
going to just touch on it just
oh, don't tease me.
Just a little bit.
Give me what I want. Give the people what they want. Murderbot.
We'll get there. So I'm going to start, first of all, and this is the only book I'm going to give true spoilers for. Venus Plus X is the only book I'm going to spoil as part of this, because, boy, I just can't say this nicely, can I? I don't really recommend reading it for the plot twist regarding gender, because I think that's one of its major flaws, is that it treats gender as sort of a shock value thing.
The M. Night Shyamalan twist is gender.
Yeah, here's the twist. Yeah, pretty literally. So I want to talk about this book first, though, A, because it's not the one I want to go deepest into, and I think it leads well into The Left Hand of Darkness, and B, because it has probably the most flaws of any book I'm going to discuss here. So Venus Plus X came out in 1960, which is part of what is interesting about it. So it is a novel about a man from I think it's set in the 50s, who is quote unquote abducted by aliens. Then ultimately, he believes he's in the company of aliens, and they have only one sex and only one gender, and they are called the Le Dom. And
really?
Yeah.
Spell it for me.
LEDOM.
Ooh.
There it is.
I'm sorry. You're gonna have to give me at least 10 more seconds to deal with that. Le Dom.
He goes and meets Le Dom. And so he believes at first that he has been not only abducted by aliens, but taken through a time machine. And the book is cut back and forth between him exploring this alien society and getting to know a few members of the society, and weird gender anecdotes from his life and the lives of people he knows back in the 50s. Ultimately, what he learns about the Le Dom is firstly that they are humans, and he believes at first that they are an evolution. This is how humanity has evolved, essentially.
Into doms?
And they are into doms. No, into a single gender society. And
of doms.
Of doms. And they are an extremely artistic, gentle people who love fashion and music and stuff.
They're fully like a Star Trek race.
Yes, they very much feel that way.
100% blue eyeshadow, flowing long dresses.
Totally, yeah. The twist at the very end of the book is that you find out that they are not only humans, they are humans in the current timeline. It's still 1950. He hasn't traveled through time. This is just a sort of, it's like a remote colony that has been created, and every infant that is born is surgically modified to grow up this way.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So that's questionable.
That's really uncomfortable for so many reasons.
It's for a variety of reasons, yes.
They had me with their name. They had me with Le Dom.
Mm-hmm.
And their Star Trek mannerisms.
This. Yeah. They are modified at birth to grow up in a single gender society and to be indistinguishable by gender. The protagonist has a problem with this.
The protagonist is not the only one.
Yeah, it ends with them brainwashing him into not going back to the world. I don't remember fully, but it ends with them sort of suppressing his ability to go back and tell everyone, because he has a full-on, like, violently homophobic freak out of, like, you deserve to be eradicated from the planet for doing this.
Oh, cool.
There's a lot to unpack about this.
There's just so much.
There's so many, and I'm going to just sort of touch on high level some of the things that are fucked up but interesting about this book. The thing that I latched onto when I first read this book back in college was that there's kind of a really interesting choice argument in it, because this dude is starting to get kind of on board with this society by the end. He's starting to be like, man, they've sort of left behind a lot of the problems that people have, and he misses the people that he left behind, but he's genuinely starting to kind of be like, yeah, this has left a lot of strife and violence behind, and he's starting to sort of relax into the society. But the instant he finds out that they are purposefully choosing to be this way, that's when he snaps into this like homophobic ideology. And that hit me as a baby queer back when I first read this book, because it felt so true to the idea of like, some people are really into the idea that trans and queer people are victims, essentially, of a natural process, and that's why you tolerate them. But the moment like they're choosing to be that way, then we got a problem.
Well, I had a question. So you mentioned something about when an infant is born, are they basically surgically modified to be of this one same gender? Or is it something that you opt into when you have the ability to consent? Is it something
There's no consent.
See,
it's screwed up. Yeah.
There's so many things.
It's literally when they're like days old.
It's analogous to the experience that intersex people have too.
Yeah, it's a very fucked up model for a society. There's a lot of really interesting commentary about like why this is done, and this will very much lead into the themes of the episode. They basically see themselves as a utopia that is created by removing the core source of violence in the world, which is gender itself and gender distinctions.
I mean, that's a take.
It's a take. And it's one that we're going to explore at length here. So settle in for that take, because Left Hand of Darkness is going to lead right on out of that one. So this book came out almost 10 years before The Left Hand of Darkness, which I think is fascinating because The Left Hand of Darkness itself is considered such an early example of this type of feminist thought in science fiction. It came out in 1969. Nice.
Nice.
And as I think I said already, Venus Plus X came out in 1960.
Yeah. I get the idea that Ursula K Le Guin, who was no slouch, probably read Venus and was just like burning inside, like, I can do this better.
I can do better than this.
I can write this. You know what? Fuck it. I'm just going to do it. And that's what happened.
So in Left Hand of Darkness, if you, like me, had not read it, a single cis dude from a sort of intergalactic alliance called the Ecumen travels to a planet called Winter, where humans on this particular Earth have evolved to, again, have a single gender, and they have a very different society, and the book is largely about him exploring the world and learning about the people, coming to very different conclusions than the protagonist of the other book, and examining the effect that that has on the society. Again, the sort of high level of that book is that the Githinian people, who are the people of Winter, have never gone to war in the history of their planet. There is theorizing both in the book and in things that Ursula Le Guin wrote about it that is basically saying like either gender is the cause of war or testosterone and people who are testosterone based are the cause of war. And if you take that away, then you have created sort of a utopian society. The Githinians are not really treated as a utopian society. There's a lot of really screwed up aspects of their society, but there's a utopian aspect to the fact that they have removed gender from interpersonal relationships. Really, the core of the book is about the Earth human protagonist, Genli, developing a relationship with Estraven, who is one of the Githinians.
Isn't it funny how that's 2 letters away from something else? Think about it.
Wait.
Think about it. Do the math. What does it sound like? Sound it out.
I mean, I get that you're going for estrogen.
God damn it.
But I don't...
Let me have this.
Spell. Thank you for your contributions, Amanda.
This is what I'm here for. I have absolutely nothing useful to say in this episode. I'm here to make the estrogen jokes.
I appreciate it. It's all about the relationship between Genli and Estraven, and Genli interrogating his own hang-ups about being even friends with somebody who inhabits multiple genders or none. Ultimately, I guess this is mild spoilers for Left Hand of Darkness, falling in love with them. That's actually, since I just stumbled over pronouns, I'll take that as a moment to highlight that both Left Hand of Darkness and Venus Plus X acknowledge that pronouns are inappropriate and not actually used in the languages that the books are being quote-unquote translated from, but all refer to the non-gendered humans as he universally.
Yeah, no, that was just sort of what you did.
It's what you did. Both of these books, I'll give them a little bit of a pass because they are explicitly being translated by cis men from Earth, and that is probably what they would do.
Yeah, especially at the time.
And then being profoundly uncomfortable with the idea of people who use he, him, or traditionally masculine titles like the king or prince doing all of these feminine things, quote unquote feminine things, like getting pregnant, literally anything. Like there's so much of these books that is about Genli and the protagonist of Venus Plus X. If, in case I'm not masking this poorly enough, I forgot what his name is because I don't care.
No one cares. Someone cares, but it's not us.
Somebody cares. It's not me. I'll look it up later when I quote from the book, but it's about them interrogating their own predispositions in this situation. It's very uncomfortable for that, and I'll touch on that a little bit more later and how I think how good it is that we have entered into an era where we're getting away from having gender theory narrated exclusively by slightly to moderately to very bigoted cishet men. There is something very interesting about taking these characters and breaking them down, particularly in The Left Hand of Darkness, where ultimately he finds a great deal of love for this society and the ways that it resists the gender hierarchies of the world that he is used to. There's a really interesting moment from almost the very end of The Left Hand of Darkness where he encounters some other humans from Earth again and is really uncomfortable because of their gender, because he has left that for so long. He's lived for over a year at this point, I think, alone on this world, surrounded by the Githenians. The moment he enters back into like this deeply rooted gendered society, he feels for a second like the shock of it and the discomfort, because the Githenians don't have gender hierarchy. They have all kinds of other hierarchies, but there is a sense of sort of the individual as being abstracted. And there's a really interesting bit where he is describing the experience of being judged solely by your character as an individual and not by your gender as being mortifying. He is, for the first time in his life, being judged solely on who he is individually, and it's upsetting. It's like confusing and bewildering. So there's a real sense in this book, in both of these early sci-fi novels, of an awareness of how pervasive and violent gender is as a concept. While I think, again, there is stuff to critique about this ideology, I do think there is also, they're not wrong. There's a lot that is true about that. The other thing that I think builds out of these is that while they are about gender, they're also about dualism in general. They both build really heavily on the idea that this is about self and other, with the other being marginalized, more than it is just about men and women. Because they also both have really big things to say about war and global conflict and xenophobia. They're almost more about those things than they are just about gender. When I was thinking about it, someone on Twitter mentioned like Cold War politics and their presence in The Left Hand of Darkness. And I thought about that, and that phrase pinged around in my brain for a little while. And then I suddenly was like, oh my God, both of these books were written during the full swing of the Cold War. The Left Hand of Darkness was being written not that long after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the perhaps closest we have ever come to nuclear war.
I mean,
perhaps. Is it? Anymore, who knows? Listen, it's 2018.
Checks the doomsday clock. It's fine.
Cries. That brief existential panic aside. And when I was flipping back through Venus Plus X, I landed on a page where the protagonist, who has a name, is thinking back on this girl that he was in love with and really wanted to marry him, and now he'll never see again because he went in the future, blah, blah, blah. There's this really vivid page where he's like thinking about her and missing her, and then spirals into this like, did she die when the atom bomb hit?
Oh my God.
Did that happen? Did that happen? And how did she die? And did it happen like they said it would happen? There's this just sense of there's this violence that we are teetering towards, and we have to figure out a way to stop doing this. So that's really deeply woven into these things. This is the era of McCarthyism and extreme East versus West ideologies and red versus blue. So gender it's a stand-in for all of this other stuff, of like the fear of the other and the vilification of the other.
But I mean, you see a lot of that in speculative fiction anyway. Like xenophobia is usually a metaphor for racism, and gender is, I suppose, a metaphor for, I don't know, everything up to and including war.
Yeah. I think there's something really interesting about the fact that these two books both portray, to some degree or other, a utopia. And I think in both cases, the authors are leaning a little bit on like, yeah, there is a utopian aspect to this, even though we've portrayed both of them as, fucked up in various ways. Because these are societies that have the ability to recognize individuals as, and in a way that is free of this particular very restrictive, very violent ideology.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's so interesting because especially at the time during the era of McCarthyism, the way that it was framed was American exceptionalism and American individualism against communism, which is the group versus the whole versus the individual. So it's really interesting to me that in this inverted picture, in this speculative examination of that tension and those ideologies, that we're seeing instead of the, I don't want to say like the Russians, these genderless beings are the ones who are examining the individual rather than the whole.
There's a really interesting piece of The Left Hand of Darkness where, as I mentioned, like Ursula Le Guin has this theory of, you know, gender being responsible for war, or at least men being responsible for war. And there's a line in The Left Hand of Darkness that is, if civilization has an opposite, it is war. And so there's this really interesting idea present in both, that gender, the way we have it, at least, is in some way decaying society. It is undermining everything that is good about us. The reason I'm coming back to that is because that's very much a point of contention when we come to sort of take apart like TERF ideology. When you look at the way, though, that Ursula Le Guin and Theodore Sturgeon both build that up, it doesn't really map onto that idea, though, because you build on the principle that gender itself is inherently violent, and this is bad, and trans people are bad because
they're upholding it. Because
they're upholding gender, and yet you're positing as part of that what you need to do then to fight that is destroy a minority you don't like. Instead of the systems of power that make these things so violent, and that the enemy is, again, the other in this, which is exactly the opposite of what either of these books is saying, and that the enemy is the concept of men or the concept of trans people, while both of these like fictional utopian societies are based on the idea that we have found some kind of unity and some kind of way of treating people as individuals without judging them on something else first. I think something that is really interesting and, again, very telling of the era that these came out of is that it's explicitly mentioned in both of these books that there is no sexual violence at all in either of these societies. That's like a thing that is pointed out very, very specifically in both. And I think that's so telling that that is what they're looking at. That is what is seen as being inherent. Gender in this setting is seen as an inherent force of violence against some people, and that if you take that away, you're taking away the violence that they would be suffering otherwise.
I mean, we'll touch on this later, but stories like these two are definitely fish out of water stories. We're getting the outsider's view of an inside of a community that they don't understand. In a similar way, we have that in the Murderbot series, but it's completely different. The other is Murderbot. And so I don't know, I think that's interesting that we went from having to have these avatars of cis masculinity illustrating these systems of gender to us and being like, look how weird this is. Also, look how cool it is. Look at these differences. It's really interesting that we had to go from outside in and now we can go from inside out.
One of the things I think is interesting about how that manifests in these stories is that in both cases, like, it's not treated as really possible for Earth humans or like modern day humans to experience these things for themselves. There's not that same sense that like people contain multitudes or anything, that real human beings here and now are always kind of coloring outside the lines. There's a sense that Earth humans now are completely trapped and stuck.
Doesn't sound like anyone was like, oh, and also you can join us and become one of us. It sounded like, no, we're going to accept you for what you are, and here's an example of our society. Well, you are too deeply entrenched in your systems of gender.
Well, and in both cases, they're actually biologically very different.
Oh, that's right.
In Left Hand of Darkness, and this is something that I find irritating in both of them. In both cases, in Venus Plus X, we already talked about it. In Left Hand of Darkness, there's a throwaway bit that implies that the people of Winter were some kind of biological experiment, and that's why they're different. This is like a world in which humans have colonized many, many, many planets. This is the only one where their gender manifests. The way their gender manifests is that they basically all have the same hormone cycles and all have the same anatomy, and that once a month they enter a condition where they can transform and either get someone pregnant or become pregnant. When that is done with, they go back. They revert to being essentially androgynous.
They stop being werewolves.
Yeah. So they basically just 90% of the time are androgynous and then just sort of manifest.
Seems really inconvenient. That seems super inconvenient and weird, but like fine.
It creates some interesting duality where they think it's really weird and gross that Earth humans can have sex all the time. They're like, what the fuck are you doing all the time? Ugh, what's this?
It's like, I've got stuff your time to do.
For that. Yeah, literally, they're like, that seems distracting and weird. And we're not about it.
I'm like knitting over here, and you would be like,
we're getting stuff done. What are you doing?
We're balancing the budget.
They literally refer to like Earth humans as perverts the entire time for that reason. Which is, again, it's a very interesting take, and I don't want to get lost in this. Left Hand of Darkness is a really good book, y'all. It holds up as a piece of gender theory. I think the parts of it that are sad to me are the fact that this is a vision of the future, and boy howdy are the concepts of gender really, really stuck in the 1950s. I really want to tell this story. My most humbling moment is saying like, oh yeah, it's sad because like this is supposed to take place in the future, but it's got this really regressive idea of gender. It's just like this quote that I've heard somewhere and can't remember where about how like science fiction isn't really about the future, it's about now. It's descriptive instead of prescriptive. Yeah, that's from the introduction to The Left Hand of Darkness, is what that quote is from. Yeah, Ursula Le Guin wrote that. So, you win this round, Ursula. She's one step ahead.
Ursula's got you there.
Reading this book was...
She's waiting.
Really, really interesting to me. It is very empathetic, and it gave me, I think, a deeper understanding of the kinds of ideologies that TERF ideology comes from, but also challenges to it. Because I genuinely don't think that if you read this book in that spirit of being, about fears of war and fears of violence, I don't feel like you can take that and spin that into, we should hate the minorities who do gender wrong. But at the same time, I think in fighting so hard against dualism and binaries, it comes to a very different solution than I think in now, the 21st century, we have come to as humans. The idea that we were going to strip away gender completely, and that would be what brought us to utopia, is very different than the way trans activists and fourth wave feminists, is that where we're at? Fourth wave feminists tend to conceive of things. And to get into that, we're going to advance the clock about 60 years to some modern literature. We just went through time. So I want to touch, I think, first on All Systems Red and the other Murderbot books, because they aren't about gender, but there's some interesting background stuff going on in these books.
I feel the most confident talking about All Systems Red because, one, I'm obsessed with it, and it's a thing I've read really recently. All Systems Red is really talking about humanity and how to come to grips with your own humanity, especially if you've been through trauma. And so there's a whole lot of background radiation of like, how do you construct a self? What things are important to you? How do you come to terms with having a body? There's just a whole lot of, how do you take care of a body when you aren't used to that? There's just a whole lot of stuff going on with Murderbot, and I love them. Austin, have you read all of them? I think there's there's four?
Yeah, I've only finished the first two, so I can only speak to them. But it is probably my favorite example of background queer inclusion of anything, because it's really, the books are really, really not about that, but you have just this stuff sort of sprinkled in. You have the fact that this is the one exception to the human gender rule. Murderbot is not human.
Yeah, they're part organic.
Murderbot is part organic, but
like an
Murderbot
AI.
is an AI, yeah, and has questions about gender. It's just kind of like, yeah, no, that's for you.
Yeah, they're trying really hard just to, like, most of the time pass as human adjacent. And they're just like, oh, yeah, gender, that too. Ugh, right?
Like, I'd rather not, actually.
Can I just opt out of this?
Can I opt out? But surrounding Murderbot are some really lovely depictions of polyamory and non-binary people and queer people, because there are just all these passing references to, like, in the second book, Murderbot meets a group of researchers, and then it comes up in their scan of this team that they're all in a group marriage, and there's like 7 of them. They're referred to as a variety of pronouns, and there's one that uses a different set of pronouns that it's referred to as, like, this is a gender that refers to this different thing commonly used by workers from this thing. It's a very different idea of what a gender could be, but one that feels in line with modern ideology much more. Like, it doesn't feel that far off that we could have gender that refers to an occupation.
Yeah.
But there are also genders in this. There are people who use she, her, and he, him, and it's very much just there. But it affects the relationships that they have to each other in a way that I think makes it feel very important to the story, even though it's not a core focus of the story.
Pretty much every character who isn't Murderbot is there to, and I mean this lovingly, teach Murderbot a lesson about themselves and about relationships with other beings, whether they're a robot or a human. Murderbot doesn't have, especially in the first book, doesn't have a lot of tools with which to approach existence with their own autonomy, and doesn't understand how to relate to other beings except in sort of a protect or attack way. Pretty much everybody that Murderbot meets is just an opportunity for Murderbot to learn things about themselves.
And I think that's why it comes off to me as an interesting extension of this earlier vision of, like, we will achieve sort of peace as a species when we get rid of this self and other idea, because you have Murderbot, who is floating around and interacting with themselves and also a lot of other AIs to whom the concept of gender and even humanity is foreign, and who are still clearly very developed and wonderful beings without that. And yet, gender is not treated as detracting from that or inherently opposed to that. It's just an add-on that these folks are not interested in opting into. And it's an aspect of other people's lives that is important to them. It might be important to their job. It might be important to their identity as a person inherently. It might be important to their relationships with other people. It's just another aspect. And so you do in some ways have that sci-fi utopia of, like, people are being taken as individuals now. There's clearly not the same kind of gendered hierarchies in this world. People are kind of free of that. It's in the making of a multitude and the ability to opt out, not the eradication of all difference.
This is not something that Murderbot would choose to opt into as a system. Murderbot's in a position to observe the gender and the presentation of others and be like, oh, okay, it doesn't matter what I do. And that's really freeing, I think, for them, because they don't have to spend a whole lot of time struggling to fit. Like, for example, if there were really rigid gender binary, there would be a whole lot of other stuff about Murderbot humorously trying to navigate that bullshit, in addition to, like, how do I walk? How much hair should I have to pass as human? The idea that this is just another thing that Murderbot doesn't have to pay a lot of attention to is cool to me. And I think if this book were written by somebody else, if it were written 10 years ago, I think that it might be, and also by somebody else, I think that there might be a whole lot more wacky hijinks with Murderbot, like, having to wear a dress one time. Like, I just don't see a lot of opportunity for that not being fucked really royally in the hands of someone with less skill and less awareness of
how people
are. Yeah.
I think that's exactly it. We've arrived at a place where we can imagine an individualism that isn't conformity. I think the vision of, like, individualism as the absence of difference, which sounds weird when you say it like that.
Oh yeah, it does.
Is also points to some of the sort of flawed concepts that both Theodore Sturgeon and Ursula K Le Guin were working with, because I think that also comes of being white folks who were talking about gender and excluding a lot of other avenues of difference. Then this vision of, like, it'll be a utopia when we're all exactly the same is not something that I find everybody is super jazzed about.
No.
And it is interesting that they basically posited societies where, like, everybody's queer and nobody's queer. And that they've tied that in very clearly with the issue of how women are treated. Particularly Left Hand of Darkness deals with a cis straight dude, presumably from good old Earth, falling in love with a non-binary person and being very confused and uncomfortable with himself and being, like, weird and standoffish for most of the book, and then suddenly being like, oh no. Anyway, the amount that Genli and Estraven are in love is not particularly important to this podcast, but I do feel like it deserves just a footnote.
Just like a nice little nod.
Boy, they loved each other so much. Anyway.
Is that the one thing you're emotional about? Read that book.
There are a lot of things I'm emotional about. Read that book. But most of them are Estraven as a character. They're a very good character. I want to round this out by talking about what the Tensorate series does, because I think it has the most... I think, for one thing, I believe it is the only book series on this list written by a trans person.
Yes, I believe you're right.
The author, J.Y. Yang, is non-binary, and that very much comes across in the way the world is constructed. Again, this is a world that has some utopian aspects, but is very much not a utopia inherently. It's also the only one on this list that is fantasy, but I think in this aspect, sci-fi and fantasy are not terribly different. Yeah, when we talk about like speculative fiction that is really reflecting commentary on the present, that's most speculative fiction.
The Tensorate series is the only one that is not, in my mind, driven by a very, maybe Murderbot isn't too, but that isn't driven by like a Western white perspective, because Tensorate is silk punk, which is my favorite of all genres. Yeah, all the punks, all the possible punks.
Yes, it's a high-grade punk. Particularly when we look at the whiteness of the Left Hand of Darkness and Venus plus X, I think that is a really important point. In the world of the Tensorate series, it's sort of a everybody is trans and no one is trans. Well, not no one, but most people are not inherently, but everybody is considered genderless and uses the pronouns they, them when they are, and then at a certain point confirm themselves as one of two binary genders. It is at least implied that the rich or the people of the cities undergo some sort of gender affirmation magic / surgery stuff to at that point conform to a specific gender. And I think this is a really interesting one because it is a choice, and it is a personal choice as it's presented in this world. And yet it's not a choice without baggage. The main character of the first book, Akeha, chooses to confirm themselves as a man, and it's a very, very fraught decision. It causes a deep strife between them and their mother, and them and their sister at first. The books do something really interesting with Akeha that was something I really, really wanted to see after reading the first book, which was Akeha later comes out again and says... And starts using they, them pronouns again, which is something that is so familiar to my experience with knowing and being surrounded by trans people. And yet I have never seen something like that in literature at all. You have this really interesting concept for a society where everyone is trans, but kind of no one is trans. And then you take that and you further break it down into, but who does this system privilege? Is it really a utopia if you have these two options and yeah, you get to pick one, but some people are still left at the margins of this. And you have two main non-binary characters in the series, Ryder and Akeha, and both deal with being misgendered and not respected and not recognized by other people in their lives. So you have, I think, just a very interesting and trans-focused ideology that takes apart the idea of even that utopia of like, now we have a utopia where people can pick and do whatever they want, except that we've still placed sort of rigid boundaries around that. The ideal that is put forth in this story is not like, well, break down the system then and make it so that everybody is the same once again, but we have to break this down further. The utopia is waiting for us, and it's when we stop corralling people violently into these tight spaces and set them loose. And that even if a system like this works for most people, inherently when you are corralling people into one thing, or two things, or three things, or any number of specific things, humans are going to kind of sprawl outside of that. Yeah. You're never going to get to a point where you're encompassing all that people want to be. And in order to allow them to be individuals, you have to allow them to be individuals. They're really fantastic books with a very broad cast of people who experience gender in a variety of ways. You have a character like Akeha who uses they, them pronouns and then switches to he, him pronouns and then uses they, them pronouns again. Their lover is a character who is more analogous to a trans trans man in this world because he has not had access to the same transition resources and doesn't want them as other characters who you could read as transmasculine, but who in their society really aren't considered trans. And so you have a world where you've set forth the premise that people get to choose and be whatever they want, and that is still fraught as long as you're corralling them in these certain ways.
Yeah, as long as you're saying one of these doors is what you get to go in.
It's a really interesting counterpoint, but I also, to The Left Hand of Darkness and to Venus Plus X, but I also feel like they are part of the same narrative. I don't think that they're in opposition, which is what I went into this expecting to see. I expected, like, gonna have these old gender books that are wrong, like, if I'm being honest. Like, that was what I was anticipating, and then you got these new gender books that get it. They're really grasping for a lot of the same things. They're both trying to create a utopia where we don't suffer from gendered violence, like, for one thing. I don't think you can argue that all 4 of these books or series aren't trying to imagine what we do to fix this problem. And in the case of the Tensorate series, I think deeply grappling with the complexities of how deep these problems run and sort of batting aside the idea that these things are utopias and digging into who is marginalized by all of these systems, which is in some ways, I wouldn't even call it pessimistic. I would say it is challenging. It is a specifically very challenging take on how we examine gender, because it just continually digs another layer deeper of like, yeah, okay, great idea, but let's go one deeper. Nope. Still fucking
This
up.
is the gender exploration that never ends.
We have not gotten it right yet. No, not this one either.
I think the fact not only are these books in communication with each other and have a lot of the same themes, but that we keep finding more basements to punch through and find more questions and more identities is, yeah, that's probably always going to be the case. I mean, I say that as a cis person, so like, lol, who knows?
But no, I think there's a lot to that. Like, we keep digging deeper, because the further we dig, the further we know we haven't gotten to it. Even, I think every single one of these books, except perhaps Murderbot, which I'll say that, like, the society in Murderbot is clearly not a utopia.
No.
But it has probably the most utopian gender system.
I feel like they're like, look, we have to go, like, figure out all of this other shit first. All of this imminent danger.
It's untroubled by gender. Whereas the rest of them are very troubled by gender. And I always say and, even when I have nothing to say.
What if I called this episode Very Troubled by Gender?
I picked the opening quote for this episode, "How does one hate a country or love a country?" Because I feel like it is so much about that. I feel like even though it doesn't specifically reference gender, as a lot of the rest of the book does, it is so true to that critique of the Cold War of gender and the threat of gender and all of the different ways that we've dug into that. Because I think throughout all of them, there is a thread that we know that this is a system of violence, but we also know that it has the capacity to be a system that contains joy for a lot of people. We know that this is something that is a part of our society, and if we can just figure out the thing that makes it not fraught, and if we can just find a way to enjoy gender and have gender in a way that is not violent towards other people and that doesn't imply a hierarchy or a threat or xenophobia or, you know, an ideological system that privileges some people above others, then we're set. Like, then we're good. But we just have not figured out how to do it yet. I think all of these stories do a really interesting job of grappling with flawed ideas of how we could get there.
We're not done panning the river for gender gold. We gotta keep doing it. Also, another potential episode title, The Cold War of Gender, or The Gender Cold War, whichever. Very good. I really liked that quote. I thought it was a nice opening to our podcast and to the topic at hand.
Yeah, and I love it because it really ties together, like, the ideology of anti-war stuff being wrapped up in gender stuff.
And identity.
And the idea that if you take this sort of to its logical extreme, like, what is love of one's country? Is it hate of one's uncountry? What is gender but the oppression of other genders? And that's the ideology that you're starting from, but then you also have this character, this is a quote from Estraven, saying, like, I just love life, and I love being in this place. I love these hills, and I'm trying to love without hating things I'm trying to love without setting off my love against what I hate.
Trying to love without contrast, I guess.
Yeah, because I think that's a big thing, is the contrast of it. The fact that these are societies that have eliminated violence not by eliminating men, but by eliminating what men are in relation to women, which is monstrous mostly and violent, and their idea that if you can take that factor out, and in the worlds of these other in these other sci-fi imaginings of gender, if you can take out that element that is the comparison, then maybe you can remove the seed of what makes it harmful and maybe just leave the joy.
Ugh.
That's my hope.
That's also my hope. I'm just going to piggyback onto your hope, make it mine too. Because you did all the hard work,
together.
so you know.
Let's hope together. Well, Amanda, I did the hard work this time, but you know what's coming up next.
All the hard work for me.
The hard work.
I get to be the one laboring in the next week. I am taking you to Lecter Church, or Lurch. Yes. My episode is about the Hannibal Lecter tetralogy, which is the series of 4 books by Thomas Harris about the pop culture icon. Put that on his CV, Hannibal Lecter. And I'm specifically talking about why the first 2 books in the trilogy work so well, and why in the trilogy, yep, that's what it is.
It lost a book as we sat here.
My brain just went no to Hannibal Rising and refused to acknowledge it. So why the first 2 work in terms of genre and what they did right, and why the latter 2, one of which is a prequel, don't work very well. And I have a lot of things to say about that and how you can use that and how it can be applicable to your own writing in a series. Hopefully. Goodness. Hope I'm not too prescriptive about it. I think it'll be cool.
And also, as I recall about how series can be composed of books in different genres. So yeah, this is what we're going to do. I hope you enjoyed this first episode. We're definitely shaking off the cobwebs of having not made a podcast for a couple months. So I can't wait for Amanda to edit out the probably solid 40 minutes of me going,
don't forget the 20 minutes of us trying to nail down what opening quote take we're going to use.
Yeah, a lot of takes on the opening quote. So hope you appreciate how it came out. I'm sure it's perfect.
I'm sure it's real good. It sounded good. I got goosebumps. So because we're a new podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could rate and review us on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you're listening to podcasts, and subscribe. That would be awesome as well. And if you want to, you can follow us on social media. Our Twitter account for the Red Pen is at Red Pen Pod. And I have an individual Twitter account. I am at Amanda H. Jean in Austin.
I too have an individual Twitter account.
We are not a hive mind.
I am at Austin Chanted, and we would love it if you would, if you enjoyed this episode, chat with us about it. Let us know stuff that you are interested in hearing about in the future. Join the conversation. We would love to talk more about gender, because it's literally, it's all I do. As a certified transsexual. All I do,
certified transsexual.
All I do really is talk about gender, so please indulge me.
Like I said, Austin Chant, PhD, genderologist.
That's me. Genderologist.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to you talking to us about our podcast and listening to the episodes in the coming weeks. And we're just really actually excited to be doing this wacky thing again where we talk into microphones and try not to interrupt each other.
It's hard.
Fucking
you have no
hard.
idea how hard it is. We just did it again. Thank you so much for joining us. And remember, if you love something, cut it up.